The year 1998 represented a major turning point for video games. It was the year when 3D well and truly took over. What had once been seen as an exciting but uncertain technical frontier had, by this point, become the industry standard. With the release of titles like Banjo-Kazooie, Spyro the Dragon, Metal Gear Solid, and Ocarina of Time, 3D gaming was no longer the bold new frontier. It was the bare minimum. If it wasn't 3D, we didn't want it. That shift in expectations left a number of unfortunate casualties in its wake. The Sega Saturn struggled for a variety of reasons, but one of those missteps was its divided focus between 2D and 3D, rather than fully committing to the latter. The system hosted some of the most technically impressive sprite work of its time, but by the late 90s, sprites themselves were already out of favor. And while the Saturn was capable of 3D, it couldn't keep pace with the more purpose-built hardware of Sony and Nintendo's machines, both of which were designed with 3D as the clear priority. And it wasn't just hardware being affected by this industry shift. Sometimes entire genres were hit just as hard, perhaps none more so than the side-scrolling platformer. What was once one of gaming's defining formats quickly lost ground as fully 3D experiences took center stage. Mega Man X4, for instance, despite being a polished and refined entry in its series, was criticized at the time for sticking to 2D gameplay and graphics, while newer, flashier 3D platformers like Crash, Spyro, and Mario 64 were all critically acclaimed and breaking sales records. And RPGs, particularly JRPGs, faced a similar turning point. If Super Mario 64 signaled the decline of traditional 2D platformers, then Final Fantasy VII did much the same for the classic top-down RPG. In fact, as far as many Western players were concerned, RPGs hadn't even really existed before Final Fantasy VII. The genre had struggled for decades to gain mainstream traction outside of Japan, but then along came FF7 to change that practically overnight. With its lavish, eye-catching, and most of all expensive CG visuals, and over-the-top high-octane Hollywood meets anime storytelling, it represented the most cutting of the cutting edge, not just for RPGs, but for gaming in general. For many, FF7 defined every RPG to come. It was long considered the gold standard, and its influence still lingers today. So when Konami released Suikoden II at the tail end of 1998, arriving in the wake of industry-defining titles like Half-Life and Ocarina of Time, many at the time couldn't help but feel like it represented an era of game design that had already gone extinct. But, as the saying goes, hindsight is 20/20, and Suikoden II might be one of the best examples of that. To be fair, that initial reception to Suikoden II wasn't entirely unwarranted. At a glance, it does look strikingly similar to the first game, which released back in 1995, well before the FF7 revolution. But as is often the case, the devil is in the details. Suikoden II introduces a wide range of small visual and quality of life improvements that may seem minor in isolation, but collectively do a lot to streamline the overall experience. Visually, the upgrades are immediately noticeable once you spend a bit of time with the game. Animations are more varied and expressive, giving story scenes a greater sense of energy, and your protagonist now has a proper running animation instead of the first game's goofy-looking, sped-up walk cycle. Backgrounds are more detailed and dynamic with better textures and shading, sometimes appearing almost photorealistic as long as you don't stare at them too hard. Character portraits are also cleaner and more refined, and some characters even receive multiple portraits to reflect different emotional states or story developments, which goes a long way toward enhancing the game's presentation. The most impactful changes, though, come from the game's quality of life improvements, particularly in its approach to inventory management. In the original game, there was no shared inventory system. Each character could only carry around a dozen items, including their equipment, and anything else had to be stored away. Duplicate items also didn't stack, meaning every slot was precious. Suikoden II keeps much of that structure intact, but introduces a shared party inventory with significantly more space, easing a lot of that micromanagement. Equipment has also been streamlined. Characters equip armor and in some cases shields as usual, but instead of dedicated accessory slots, each character has 3 flexible item spaces that can be used for either accessories or consumables. Since characters can only use items they're personally holding during battle, this creates a subtle but meaningful layer of strategy when deciding how to distribute resources across your party. Party management, meanwhile, has been made far less cumbersome thanks to a thoughtful overhaul of the headquarters. As in the first game, you're still recruiting 108 Stars of Destiny, gradually filling out a home base with playable characters, merchants, and various support NPCs. The original game's HQ took the form of a vertically structured tower that was easy enough to understand, but inconvenient in practice. Key services were spread across multiple floors, forcing you to constantly move between them whenever you wanted to assemble and outfit a new party. Even with an elevator, it often felt like unnecessary busywork. Suikoden II replaces that structure with a more natural castle-like layout that prioritizes convenience. Essential services are now clustered together on the ground floor, while more extraneous features like the library or bathhouse are relegated to the further reaches. The warehouse, inn, fast travel, and party management NPCs are all located within a short distance of each other, while shops, the blacksmith, rune master, and appraiser are all grouped together along a single stretch, functioning almost like a medieval strip mall. On top of that, shops now allow you to sell old equipment at the point of purchase, and you can freely equip any recruited character, even those not currently in your active party, when managing gear at HQ. There's even a best equip option for quickly optimizing loadouts. While the warehouse itself holds fewer total items this time around, I presume to discourage hoarding, it compensates by letting you sell excess inventory directly, cutting down on additional steps. Individually, these are all relatively small adjustments, but taken together, they significantly smooth out the experience of managing your party and resources, which is especially important given how central those systems are to the game as a whole. If anything, they directly address what I found to be the biggest mechanical weakness of the first game. Money is also easier to earn this time around, but still meaningful in how it's spent. You're far less reliant on gambling to build up your funds, first of all, both because regular battles now reward significantly more potch on average, and because the gambling system itself has been toned down. Bets are now capped at 3,000 potch, and the double or nothing option has been removed entirely, making extended winning streaks far less lucrative. Even so, money never feels disposable. With around 80 playable characters to outfit, each one wielding a unique weapon that can be upgraded all the way to level 16 with costs scaling exponentially, keeping your army properly equipped remains a significant financial commitment. It's not just the interface that's been improved either. Shops themselves have been expanded in clever ways. Every item, equipment, and rune shop now features a rotating rare finds section, which refreshes with new items every half hour or so. These items aren't exclusive or missable, but they do give you the opportunity to access powerful equipment earlier than intended if you're willing to pay the hefty price tags. It adds a subtle layer of decision-making. Do you invest early for a potential advantage, or conserve your funds for more gradual upgrades? Either way, the system encourages you to stay engaged with the game's economy rather than treating shops as one-time pit stops. Just be sure to decide quickly, because those rare items won't be there forever. The sequel also introduces an entirely new type of vendor in the form of trade shops. These allow you to buy goods in one region and sell them in another for profit, effectively turning the game's world into a light trading network. I get the feeling this was designed as a replacement for the first game's reliance on gambling as a primary money-making strategy. As long as you pay attention to regional price differences, trading quickly becomes one of the most efficient ways to earn potch outside of combat, rewarding players who are observant and willing to engage with the system on a deeper level. Battles in Suikoden II function very similarly to the first game, but with enough refinements to make the system feel noticeably more polished. Once again, both your party and the enemies can field up to 6 characters, and outside of spellcasting, turns play out simultaneously rather than one at a time. The result is a combat system that moves at a brisk, almost rhythmic pace, keeping encounters engaging without ever feeling sluggish. Experience is still governed by a flat requirement of 1000 EXP per level, with EXP rewards scaled based on the difference between your level and the enemy's level. This means under-leveled characters gain dramatically more experience, sometimes jumping a dozen levels from a single fight, while over-leveled characters earn next to nothing. In practice, this creates a self-balancing progression curve that keeps your massive roster viable without the need for excessive grinding, while making both under-leveling and over-leveling equally unlikely. Utility options like Runaway and Bribe also return, with the latter becoming more reliable the more money your party carries. Once your party reaches parity with enemy levels, Runaway is replaced with Let Go, which guarantees a successful escape every time. Just like with the first Suikoden, I really like this because it communicates to the player that they've effectively outgrown the current area, removing the friction of unnecessary encounters while still leaving the option to engage if they're hunting for item drops or extra money. It's the kind of subtle feedback system that respects both the player's time and agency. So far, this is all exactly how things worked in the first game, but where Suikoden II really begins to distinguish itself is in its expansion of the rune system. In the original game, each character was limited to a single rune, typically granting a set of spells, a special attack, or passive bonuses, while alternatively, using runes as weapon enhancements were permanent choices that carried a degree of risk. The sequel retains these core ideas, but greatly expands their flexibility. Weapon enhancements are no longer permanent, removing much of that pressure. And more importantly, characters can now equip multiple runes as they grow stronger, up to 3 slots in total, positioned on the forehead and both hands. While certain runes are restricted to specific body parts, most can be freely assigned, opening up a much wider range of customization. This added flexibility is further supported by the introduction of consumable spell scrolls, which allow players to cast specific spells without dedicating an entire rune slot. This can be a great choice for situational magic that may not justify a permanent slot. Meanwhile, the underlying magic system still operates on a Vancian charge structure, where each rune contains 4 tiers of spells, and characters gain additional charges as they level up. However, the sequel adds another layer through combination magic. Equipping certain pairs of runes unlocks powerful spells that can devastate entire enemy groups. For example, earth and fire runes can combine to cause a volcanic eruption, or lightning and water runes can form a thunderstorm. These don't consume standard spell charges, but are limited to just one use before needing to be recharged at an inn. Their limited use adds a strategic layer to when and how they're deployed, rewarding players who experiment with different rune pairings. And of course, unite attacks return as one of the system's defining features. Specific combinations or even entire groups of characters can perform unique cooperative moves, ranging from stronger physical attacks to full-party strikes or spell-like effects. In a game built around assembling a roster of over 100 characters, these unite attacks serve as both a mechanical incentive and a narrative reward, encouraging players to mix and match party compositions while reinforcing the relationships between characters. It's a system that not only deepens combat, but ties directly into the game's broader themes of camaraderie and unity. The one-on-one duels from the first game also return, once again appearing at key story moments and operating on our rock-paper-scissors framework. You try to predict your opponent's intent through their dialogue and then choose the appropriate counter, repeating the process until one side falls. It's a simple system on paper, but one that works surprisingly well in context, giving major story confrontations a sense of tension and intimacy that standard battles don't really replicate. The tactical war battles, however, see a far more substantial overhaul. Where the original game treated them as an expanded version of the duel system, Suikoden II instead reimagines them as a simplified strategy RPG, closer in spirit to something like Advance Wars. Units are now moved across a grid-based battlefield, with each group offering distinct abilities. Some specialize in mobility, others in healing or offensive magic, and encounters play out as you maneuver your forces to either eliminate enemy units or push toward an enemy base. Importantly, the stakes remain just as high as before. Characters who fall in these battles can die permanently, which in turn can lock you out of the game's best ending. It's a much more engaging system overall, one that better reflects the scale of the conflict while still maintaining that ever-present sense of consequence. There's also the way the game handles returning characters. Out of the 108 recruitable party members, about a third are carried over from the first Suikoden, and the sequel takes advantage of the PlayStation's memory card in a way that feels both novel and meaningful. I guess the Suikoden team at Konami saw Psycho Mantis reading the player's memory card in Metal Gear Solid and thought to themselves, "Shit, we could do that too."
So, you like Suikoden?
If you have a completed save file from the original game, returning characters will inherit a portion of their previous progress, levels, weapon upgrades, and occasionally even their equipment and runes. The result is that when characters like Flick and Victor join early on, they can arrive as high as level 33 while the rest of your party hasn't even reached level 10 yet. This is a really cool way to reward returning players and enhance the sense of continuity between the two games without completely alienating newcomers. That's not all though. That same save data unlocks a late-game side quest allowing you to recruit McDole, the protagonist of the original game. Equipped with the Soul Eater rune and a powerful Unite attack alongside Ryo, he's easily one of the strongest characters available. The trade-off, however, is logistical rather than mechanical. Whenever he leaves your party due to story events, which happens very frequently, he returns to Gregminster, a location with no fast travel access, forcing you to manually trek back to retrieve him. It's an unusual form of balancing, less about limiting the character's power, and more about making that power inconvenient to maintain. Beyond its core systems, Suikoden II also significantly expands its range of minigames, adding a layer of variety that helps break up the main campaign. The returning dice game is joined by activities like fishing, rope climbing races, and even whack-a-mole. But the standout addition is easily the Cooking Contest side quest, an extended tongue-in-cheek storyline centered around the mafia and the theft of a legendary recipe. What follows is a series of escalating cook-offs judged by members of your own army, where each round has you assembling 3-course meals by combining basic ingredients into complex dishes, such as ice cream and sugar combining into pudding, and don't think about that too much, it makes perfect sense. It's mechanically simple, but narratively it leans fully into its own ridiculousness, and that's exactly what makes it so memorable. In fact, the entire cooking subplot feels like a window into the developer's own sense of humor, and in fact they even admit in interviews that they got carried away with it because they just thought it was way too funny. The cooking subplot even culminates in a set of joke credits complete with an acting coach. Hilarious. And that playful energy isn't confined to just one side quest. It's present throughout the whole game, such as with the inclusion of Muku Muku and his entourage of flying squirrels, which was reportedly added simply because someone on the team thought it would be funny to have a team that was just Ryo and a bunch of squirrels. And apparently there's a talking octopus family you can recruit that I somehow completely missed. I've beaten this game at least 3 times, and I never knew about that before now. This is the kind of absurdity that really shows how much fun the developers were clearly having while making it, and I love to see this kind of stuff. The area of Suikoden II that's most consistently praised is its story, and it's easy to see why. Following the release of Suikoden I, the development team at Konami received several fan letters praising the first game's narrative, and so they made story a major focus for the sequel. Several moments of Suikoden II have stuck with me over the years. And yes, I am about to get into spoiler territory, so consider this your warning to skip ahead. Suikoden II primarily follows 3 teenagers: Ryo, his older sister Nanami, and his best friend Joey. Ryo and Joey have joined the Highland Army as cadets during a war with the city-state of Joustin. Their training quickly goes awry when their captain, Raud, carries out a false flag operation at the behest of the sadistic Prince Luca Blight, burning down the camp in order to frame Joustin and escalate the conflict. The 2 boys witness the betrayal and escape the burning camp, only to be separated in the chaos. Ryo is found and captured by Joustin resistance fighters, led by Flick and Victor, until Joey intervenes to break him out. Returning to their hometown and reuniting with Nanami, the 3 are arrested by Highland authorities and sentenced to death as traitors. Rescued at the last moment by Flick and Victor, they join the Joustin resistance, eventually forming the Dunan Resistance Army to oppose Highland's tyranny, a group that grows in both size and complexity as the story unfolds, sometimes facing devastating betrayals from within. The story shines in its tonal range. Returning players enjoy fan service like the revival of the vampiric necklord, while lighter, almost sitcom-like moments exist alongside genuinely tragic beats. Ryo and Nanami's infiltration of an academy high school to enlist the town's mayor, for instance, is largely played for laughs, while other scenes, such as a child rendered mute after the trauma of nearly being murdered by Luca, are deeply affecting. But perhaps the most shocking subversion comes with the defeat of Luca Blight. What many expect to be the story's climax is actually just the end of Act 2. That's not to say he goes down without a fight, though. The Dunan army's climactic confrontation with Luca is some of the most masterfully executed storytelling I've seen in a classic RPG. After 2 strategic war battles that serve to corner and force Luca into an ambush, players face a 3-part boss fight requiring 18 characters across 3 separate encounters. Luca himself is one of the most powerful solo enemies in the game, using multiple turns per round and devastating rune abilities. And even after all of that, when he's exhausted, cornered by the Dunan army, and assaulted with a barrage of arrows, Luca only goes down after one final duel with Ryo. But even in his dying breath, he expresses pride in the horrors he's committed, boasting about the amount of dead bodies left in his wake, remaining a monster to his very end. But that's not where the story ends. It continues for several hours past that, with Dunan working to clean up Luca's mess and try to establish peace with the remainder of the Highland army. I've seen many people consider the post-Luca sections of the story to be less compelling, but I find them fascinating. Defeating the tyrant doesn't erase the devastation he caused. Villages remain in ruins, Pilica remains mute, and countless civilians and soldiers remain dead. The Highland Army still exists, the war is still going, and the world isn't magically healed just because the villain is gone. Most importantly, though, Luca Blight was never the true source of the conflict anyway. He was a horrifying antagonist, yes, but the emotional and thematic core of the story revolves around Ryo and Joey. The game can't end with the death of Luca because it still has to resolve what was a far more personal and devastating tension than any external threat, that being Joey's betrayal. The true heart of Suikoden II's story isn't found in the clash between the Highland Kingdom and the Joustin rebels. The true heart of the story lies in the relationship between Ryo, Nanami, and Joey, 3 friends whose bond is tested in ways both intimate and devastating. During the story's first act, Joey stays behind to hold off Highland soldiers, allowing Ryo and the rest of the group to escape safely. Once everyone is successfully safe in their city of operations, Ryo and Nanami wait outside the city's walls, hoping against hope that Joey will return alive. Hours pass and their anxiety never wavers, until Joey does finally appear, leading to a deeply emotional reunion that feels like a triumph. But as the story unfolds, that reunion is cast in a tragic new light. Joey's loyalty has shifted back to Highland. He betrays the resistance, assassinating its leader and undermining everything Ryo and Nanami have fought for so far. A moment that once inspired relief, those uncertain hours spent watching the horizon for any sign of their friend, now stings with heartbreak. Joey's return wasn't an act of survival, it was a calculated move in a larger scheme, a revelation that reframes the emotional stakes of their friendship. To be clear, Joey isn't driven by any kind of malice. Both he and Ryo share the same goal in ending the war. The difference lies in their methods and the values that shape them. Ryo and Nanami were orphans raised by Master Genkaku, a disgraced former hero who sacrificed his reputation by refusing to compromise his morals during a time of war. In contrast, Joey's mother married into a wealthy Highland family, only for Joey to be ostracized by his peers and abused by his stepfather. Ryo and Nanami were raised learning that loyalty and family are chosen and earned, and Joey, while cherishing his friendship with the two, internalized a lesson that the only loyalty that mattered was that to his homeland. This ideological conflict is embodied in the twin runes they both receive. Joey wields the Black Sword rune, Ryo the Bright Shield rune. Within the Dunan library, one can read the legend of the 27 True Runes, an ancient tale of sword and shield, two entities locked in battle until both shatter. This, to me, stands as a literal reflection of Ryo and Joey's story. If neither yields, their bond is surely destined to end in mutual destruction. The story's depth owes much to director Yoshitaka Murayama, who reportedly wrote nearly all of Suikoden II's narrative himself. He drew inspiration from the classic Chinese tale White Vengeance, a historical drama about two opposing friends, one strong but disliked by others, the other weaker yet able to succeed by earning the trust of others. For his take on the story, Murayama split the disliked hero into two characters, Luca and Joey, with the former receiving the evil qualities, while Joey was given the more sympathetic traits. As a result, Luca Blight now embodies the darker qualities that Joey might one day embrace, and this layering means the story couldn't conclude with Luca's death alone. For true resolution, both Luca and Joey's arcs had to reach their end. Of course, we can't forget the third member of the trio, Ryo's older sister Nanami. In reading behind-the-scenes interviews, I was somewhat surprised to learn just how much care the team put into getting her just right. The story practically required that players like her in order for the emotional beats to land, but the team was worried she might come off as uninteresting, or worse, annoying. Nanami is a very high-energy character, which was somewhat unusual at the time for the protective motherly archetype she was meant to fill, and this made the developers a bit nervous. The character designer also walked a delicate tightrope here. Nanami had to be cute, but not to a distracting degree, since she shared so many scenes with Ryo and Joey. The team spent a surprising amount of time reworking her introductory scene in particular, such as in this moment where she shakes Ryo by the collar in excitement. The designers seemed especially proud of this Looney Tunes-esque crater left in a cliff after she pushes Ryo into it. This gag was not in the script and was added on a whim by the sprite animators, and it ended up being a favorite among several of the staff. During her Unite attack with Ryo, sometimes she'll just sit down and enjoy a picnic while her brother does all the work, and when presented with the attack's usual dramatic freeze frames, this had me laughing out loud the first time I saw it. It's stuff like this that highlights how carefully her energy was balanced with humor. The team's fears of Nanami being poorly received by audiences thankfully didn't come true. In fact, Nanami turned out to be a fan favorite. And for me, there are two distinct moments in this game that define her character. And interestingly, they do so by demonstrating her duality. The first comes shortly after Luca Blight's fall. With the war seemingly winding down, Nanami begins to question her and Ryo's ongoing involvement. In her eyes, the worst is over now that Luca is gone, yet the conflict still threatens their lives. She tells Ryo that they could just abandon it all, find a quiet forest, and build a peaceful cabin together. Here, the game gives players a dialogue choice. Much like in the first game, dialogue options are everywhere throughout Suikoden II's story, and normally these choices don't change much of anything. But also like in the first game, there are a small handful of instances where these choices will matter. And this is perhaps the biggest example of that. You may decide to agree with Nanami's decision to run away, perhaps assuming that the game won't actually let you go through with it. But it does. If you agree with Nanami, she and Ryo skip town, leaving only a note behind to assure the others that they haven't been murdered or kidnapped. And this single dialogue choice triggers an entire alternate story branch where, instead of experiencing the intended events within this town, the two siblings flee across several towns and scale a mountain while fending off endless hordes of undead. Far from a carefree escape, their decision exposes them to the harsh consequences of shirking responsibility. Necklord continues his terror, former allies fight without their support, and towns remain terrorized and vulnerable. And now, the two are seeing the horror from the ground level. Eventually, the two do reach a small cabin and, for a little while anyway, attempt to pretend that life is normal, even as zombies continue to roam nearby. That is, until Flick and Victor find them, sympathetic to their anxieties but disappointed in their decisions. Shu, however, is less forgiving. He slaps Ryo and explains that one of their generals died due to his absence. Nanami and Ryo's attempt to escape didn't magically lead to peace. It only brought about further death and suffering. And while you're intended to return to the main story at this point, players can instead choose to continue fleeing responsibility, instantly triggering the game's bad ending. A single static image of a cabin in the woods with no real resolution. You don't even get to see the credits. It's a stark narrative statement. Choosing the easy way out comes at a cost. And in that moment, the game asks the player, "Are you proud of yourself?" And at the other end of the dial, we have Nanami's ultimate act of sacrifice near the end of the game, when she takes the brunt of a volley of arrows meant for Ryo. Once again, player choice can affect the outcome here. Nanami may live or die depending, but regardless of what actually happens, the story first leads you to believe that she has perished. After defeating the final boss, players face one last choice. Continue leading Dunan, ending the game with the credits, or return home, unlocking a playable epilogue. In this epilogue, Ryo returns to the cliff he and Joey marked at the beginning of the game, where they had promised to meet if they ever lost their way. Joey is waiting, and only after Ryo refuses to fight back do the two finally reconcile. After this, it is then revealed that Nanami didn't actually die. She faked her death, a fact known only to Dunan's doctor and Shu, the army strategist. Unlike the previous runaway scenario, this wasn't a selfish act. Nanami recognized that Ryo would always put her safety above all else, even over the Dunan army itself. And in those moments when she was facing death, she realized she isn't worth that. While the army could survive without her, it couldn't survive without Ryo. To protect both her brother and the cause they had been fighting for, Nanami confides in Shu, and I'm paraphrasing here, Ryo needs someone to come home to, but Dunan also needs Ryo. If the day ever comes when he decides his duties to Dunan are fulfilled, then and only then can you tell him the truth. Tell him that I'll be home, waiting for him. This moment marks the first time Nanami puts the good of the many above the good of herself and her brother. She has always meant well, but she could be somewhat short-sighted. But here, she makes a completely selfless decision, willingly risking the possibility of never seeing Ryo again for the sake of protecting everyone else around her. And what makes this twist so powerful is how it ties back to Ryo's defining trait, his ability to unite people. Multiple characters throughout the story remark on his uncanny talent for bringing people together, which explains why he is entrusted as the army's leader even at his young age. When Ryo risks his life for Nanami, she realizes that his gift, his ability to inspire, connect, and lead, is far more important than anything she alone can offer. In many other stories, a last-minute fake death like this might feel cheap, but here it lands perfectly, ending Nanami's arc on a note that is both selfless and ultimately hopeful. All that being said, this story does stumble in a few areas. The core trio of Ryo, Joey, and Nanami is excellent, and returning characters like Flick and Victor continue to shine. The flaws of Suikoden II's story aren't so much in the quality of the writing as they are in what isn't there. Luca Blight, for example, is an effective villain, but his backstory feels frustratingly thin. From what I can tell, he seems to hold a grudge against the world due to how he was treated for being a half-blood royal, but that's about all the game tells you. I only learned the bulk of his motivations from developer interviews, where the writer laid out a detailed history that never made it into the actual game. The motivations themselves are compelling, but without them being in the game, Luca can come across as a fairly generic mustache twirler. And a similar issue arises with Raud, the military captain who burns down the training camp at the story's outset. He reappears a few times, but has little lasting impact and doesn't even appear as a boss fight. Again, it's developer commentary that reveals he was supposed to be motivated by his sister's blindness, using the Highland Army's bribe to carry out the false flag operation, a perfectly reasonable plot point that simply wasn't included in the final cut. Again, this story isn't weak, but it does leave loose ends that could have added depth. Other supporting characters and subplots suffer from similar underdevelopment. The Highland commanders, Kulgan and Seed, never get meaningful arcs. The Pilica subplot is revolved in a single line and then we never see her again. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure Luca's sister Julia isn't so much as mentioned until the exact second she becomes plot relevant. Hey, I'm editing right now. Don't correct me. I am wrong. Julia does show up in at least 2 major scenes before that. I had just completely forgot about them for some reason. My bad. None of this is actively bad, but it does reek of scenes that were cut to meet deadlines. Pacing and flow can also be frustrating. Some storylines play out almost entirely within a single town, which might not sound bad until you realize that many of the game's towns aren't particularly large, and so triggering new events often requires running back and forth between the same handful of locations. The town square, City Hall, the inn, back to City Hall, back to the inn, over and over. It's only an issue a few times, but once you notice it, it's hard to ignore. I also thought the final boss was kinda lame, especially compared to the climactic encounters with Luca. Both in concept and in execution, there was just nothing about this fight that I found very interesting at all. On the structural side, I do appreciate that the sequel has fewer instances of forcing certain characters into your party, thanks to the new convoy feature, which lets story-relevant characters stay with you without requiring them to be in your active party. While this does reduce frustration, it also means there's less incentive to experiment with different characters, since you can largely just stick with your favorites for the whole game. To be fair, that was the entire point of these games having so many available party members in the first place. Murayama figured that with so many different characters, every player would find at least 1 or 2 that they really liked, similar to how popular shonen manga of the time tended to have large ensemble casts with wide overall appeal. Suikoden II, like the first game, is also very easy by traditional RPG standards. Seriously, I never even came close to a game over, and while this does make the game more accessible, it can also make the mechanics feel shallow for players seeking a challenge. The game is fully aware of this. Its strength has always been its story, and it leans into that almost exclusively. If you're looking for a low-stress RPG with a compelling narrative and a rich cast, Suikoden II delivers in spades. If you want something more mechanically demanding and fulfilling, though, you may want to look elsewhere. Outside of the story itself, one thing I really like about these early Suikoden titles is how relatively small-scale they are compared to some other JRPGs. Games like Final Fantasy frequently aim for sprawling, world-spanning epics that eventually give the player free reign over an entire planet. The problem is, that kind of scale can ironically make the world feel emptier. When you have access to an entire planet, you may start to wonder why there are only a handful of cities. No matter how charming those cities are, it can be a little jarring when you realize the entire population of this fantasy world could probably fit comfortably inside a Starbucks. Suikoden, on the other hand, limits its scope to a single kingdom or continent, and that restriction works in its favor. The world feels more intimate and alive. It's dense, full of people, politics, and conflicts, and you can't help but wonder what may lie beyond the borders of the game's map. Presumably, the continent in Suikoden II is just south of the one from the first game. You even visit Gregminster at one point. While traveling there, the battle music shifts to that of the first game, signaling that you've crossed borders. On the other hand, I'm a bit more mixed on the game's optional timed side quest involving Clive, a returning character from the first game. The quest runs on an invisible timer that starts the moment you hit New Game. To see it to completion, you have to reach certain cities before a set number of in-game hours have passed, with the final event giving you less than 20 hours to complete everything. Essentially, this means you need to blaze through the entire game in a fraction of the usual playtime if you want the full side quest experience. Final Fantasy IX also does something like this, and I think it's dumb there too. Look, it's not like the Clive side quest is essential to the story or anything. And as long as you trigger the first event in less than 3 hours, you can just recruit Clive, ignore the rest of his side quests, and still be able to get the game's best ending. It's just that I've never understood why an RPG of all genres would encourage players to rush through like this. RPGs excel at exploration and world building, and when I'm playing one, I like to take my time. I like to talk to NPCs and absorb little extraneous bits of lore and flavor text. But because of this single side quest, I felt pressured to do the exact opposite. And indeed, many online walkthroughs will even go so far as to recommend that you button mash through dialogue and run from battles in order to make it in time, and I just can't fathom that being a fun way to experience an RPG. I understand the intent. It's meant to spark discussion between players and reward multiple playthroughs. And yes, probably also to nudge people toward buying the official strategy guide. But personally, I couldn't be bothered. I just used a Game Shark to adjust my playtime. And if anyone's ready to roll their eyes at the mere mention of a cheat device, be so for real right now. The HD remaster lets you turn off the event timer entirely. I'm doing the same thing here, just with extra steps. But with how strong the story and setting are, it's a shame the English translation didn't really do them justice. The script is just as bland and rudimentary as the first games, only now with somehow even more noticeable gaffes. Typos, inconsistent spellings, awkward phrasing, weird mistranslations, you name it. At one point the game even refers to the same town by both its English and Japanese names. Joey, one of the lead characters, doesn't even have his name spelled consistently. Worse still, the translation process apparently introduced a handful of glitches unique to the North American release. For example, when recruiting the main character from the first game, the game is supposed to carry over whatever name you gave him from your memory card. Due to a glitch though, it only transfers capital letters, so if you named the character Tur, his canon name, it instead just overwrites the default McDole with Tickdole. There's also a pretty massive softlock glitch late in the game. At a certain point in the town of Tinto, entering any building before triggering a certain cutscene will result in the game not knowing where to place your character when the cutscene is over. This leaves you trapped in an empty house where none of the exits work, forcing you to reset. Other glitches can permanently prevent unique item drops, and a few music tracks don't play at all due to the way the disc was formatted. This includes a second end credits song, 2 of the war battle themes, and a special cutscene where a character sings a vocal rendition of the game's main theme. This results in many war battles going without any music at all, and the singing scene is instead just 2 unskippable minutes of awkward silence while the animation runs. Overall, though, none of this is game-breaking, and the translation is still functional enough that you'll be able to follow the storyline just fine. But considering how far English localizations had come by 1998, Suikoden II's script feels dated. And as I brought up before, that sense of feeling behind the times was something this game had to contend with a lot when it was first released. When Suikoden II launched in Japan, it performed fairly well both critically and commercially. In the West, however, reception was noticeably more lukewarm. While it received some high marks, 8s and 9s, it also earned several 7s and even a few 6s, which is surprising for a game that's now widely described as critically acclaimed. At first glance, reviews were positive, praising the story, the sheer number of recruitable characters, practically non-existent load times, and an expanded variety of minigames. Dig a little deeper though, and you'll see that reviewers really did get pretty darn hung up on the game's old-fashioned graphics and presentation, and that's where the bulk of the critiques landed. A few also noted the uneven English translation, and others felt that the sequel didn't do enough to differentiate itself from its predecessor. Sales in the West also suffered, partly due to its release on 9/9/99, which coincided with the North American launch of Final Fantasy VIII, and of course, the Sega Dreamcast. But also because by that point, many RPG fans had simply moved on from this style of game. Make no mistake, Suikoden II iterated and improved on the original in many subtle and meaningful ways, but those changes were incremental rather than drastic or revolutionary. As a result, on the surface at least, the first 2 Suikoden games can appear nearly identical. Suikoden II may have a great story, but to experience that story, players had to look past a first impression that wasn't particularly captivating. The game was 2D from top to bottom. 2D characters, 2D backgrounds, 2D world map, with only the battle backgrounds and spell effects even hinting at 3D. The game reuses the same engine and assets as a game from 1995, and it definitely shows. In an era of 3D experimentation, Suikoden II just couldn't compete. The sequel wasn't exactly making strides to innovate the RPG landscape, and I'm not just speaking in comparison to the big-name franchises like Final Fantasy. Even mid-budget RPGs were pushing the envelope. Wild Arms had full 3D battles back in 1996, and in fact, on the very same day as Suikoden II, TOSE released Thousand Arms, no relation to Wild Arms, funny enough, a delightfully quirky comedy RPG that offered 2D characters in 3D environments, and combined RPG gameplay with a prominent dating sim mechanic that enhanced the player's weapons depending on which girls they chose to court. And this was nearly a decade before Persona 3's social links, I'll point out. To top it off, the game even featured some fairly extensive voice acting. Hey, side note, I used to own a copy of Thousand Arms, and I even beat it at one point. I honestly regret selling it now because I think it'd make for a fun video, but oh well, it is what it is. Compared to all that, Suikoden II felt restrained, almost stubbornly so. No voice acting, no analog or rumble support, and very minimal use of FMV at a time in the industry when people were going absolutely gaga for full motion video. Hell, your character couldn't even move diagonally. Some of this even appears to be deliberate, such as the developers mentioning a distaste for full motion video in interviews. Visually, Suikoden II didn't seem all that much more impressive than like a late-stage Super Nintendo game. Its use of memory cards to carry over save data from the first game was clever, but ultimately, Suikoden II came off as incredibly safe and even archaic. Any mainstream momentum the game might have had prior to its release was neutered by its competition, and by the time it came out, it already seemed to be about 5 years out of date. For those who weren't around back then, or maybe just don't remember, it needs to be said just how obsessed with 3D graphics the gaming community was back in the late 90s. 3D was everything. It didn't matter how primitive that 3D was. 2D was out, 3D was in. Period. Take, for instance, this now infamous image that describes the PlayStation's, quote, mind-boggling effects, while showcasing the most comically basic 3D shapes cobbled together with no textures or lighting whatsoever. It can, of course, be easy to look back now and scoff at this mindset, since 2D games are still being released now and are anything but dead, but at the time, people were increasingly demanding full 3D visuals and gameplay. Any game that chose to stick to more traditional design sensibilities were met with disappointment or, at best, ambivalence. For another example, check out this magazine article comparing the graphics of the PlayStation Castlevania title Symphony of the Night with those of Castlevania 64. Note how they express almost a disgust at the idea of the PS1 title being a 2D side-scroller. Of course, I ask you which of those two games is more beloved now. Clearly, we've since learned that 3D doesn't automatically make a game great, but back then, a game having 2D visuals wasn't treated as a simple aesthetic or artistic preference. It was seen as unambitious and lazy. Suikoden II is one of those games that makes me look back at the late 90s obsession with 3D and think to myself, man, I'm glad we learned better. When removed from the context of its release, and when taken as its own piece of art rather than being endlessly compared to its competition, Suikoden II absolutely does hold up. The game's reputation has only seemed to improve with time. It's now often considered not only the best in the Suikoden franchise, and not only one of Konami's best games, but one of the greatest JRPGs ever made outside of the Square Enix pantheon. If games like Ocarina of Time and Final Fantasy VIII were to represent the extravagant, cutting-edge rock and roll concert that wows audiences with spectacle and pyrotechnics, then Suikoden II represents the small, soulful acoustic guitar ballad that moves the audience to tears. The cutting edge is only so for a few years, but genuine sincerity and heart will be forever timeless. Much like its lead character, Suikoden II's real greatest strength is its capacity to connect with people. And man, I can't wait for the anime. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe. YouTube has demonetized my entire channel, so if you'd like to support me, please consider joining my Patreon. The link is in the description. See you in the next video, and you guys just keep doing what you're doing, whatever that is. Yep, we'll see ya.